Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. For some people, reinvention just seems easy. Our guest today is one of those people. John Killacky moved to Vermont to run the Flynn Theater in Burlington in 2010, followed by careers as a dancer, a dance company manager in New York City, a performance curator in Minneapolis, an arts administrator in San Francisco. Killacky is also an award-winning filmmaker and a writer. He is currently a Vermont legislator. I am delighted to welcome the multifaceted John Killacky to Across the Fence. Hi, John.
Hello, Fran. Nice to be with you.
Great to have you here. So you just published Because Art, Commentary, Critique, and Conversations. It's a collection of your writing over the last several decades. What was the impulse to create this anthology?
Well, my youngest brother, there's 5 siblings, I'm the middle child. My youngest brother told me that my father had given him a cassette tape and said, I've shared some of the thoughts of my life in case any of my kids wanted to listen to it. Now, I've never heard the tape, but I was really inspired by that. And during the pandemic, I thought about, well, what would my cassette tape be of my life? So I went through, I've been very blessed. I've published like 300 articles and essays, and I went through them, and I found 56, and some of them are speeches, some of them are talks, some of them are essays I've written, political commentaries, some are interviews with artists, and some are critical analysis of artists. And right. I think of it sort of as a living archive of my life.
Absolutely, and even scripts from some of your films. So you started out as a professional dancer, and I love this photo of you. It's just beautiful. Then you moved on to arts administration for significant institutions across the country. You have worked to shift cultural expectations and include community. And that's work that many organizations are striving for today, because for many, the arts remain something for privileged, highly educated people. How have you approached making the arts more inclusive, impactful, and not the purview of the elite?
Well, that photo of my 20-year-old dancer self, I was very much involved in the studio, in the theater, with dance companies, in the dance world. It was very siloed. But by the 90s, I was working at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis, and I was a curator there, and I was presenting contemporary artists. And there were a lot of angry artists dealing with a lot of response to the AIDS pandemic. And what happened was called the culture wars. And what I realized is that as I was presenting these artists, I was presenting them sort of in the temple of a museum. And I realized that there was no connection to the community. So it was a really pivot for me to realize that we had to take our museums, our theaters, our dance companies, and change it from a temple model into a community center model. So there's talks I've given at the Getty in 2004, and that's included in the book. And I called it that, about transforming our temples into community centers. And that's been very important to me ever since.
And it can be done. So as you mentioned, as a gay man, you had a profound lived experience of the horrendous tragedy of AIDS. It was a time when dozens of your friends died. The arts lost untold numbers of talented artists. It's a time that influenced you and your work. So in slightly a different way of looking at this, what is the role of the arts in cultural transformation then and now?
Well, if you look back at the 80s, when the AIDS pandemic was just beginning, many of the artists at that time were the first responders. ACT UP organized, and there were many artists in ACT UP. Keith Haring, the visual artist who I write about in the book. Bill T. Jones started making work about that as his partner died, and then many of his friends died. Keith Haring even did a set for Bill, and Peter Hujar, the photographer. So in the book, as I talk about these artists, I really also get to talk about myself, because as I was experiencing this, and you said dozens, but actually my diaries list 116 people. that I
Wow.
lost from AIDS. And so by the 90s, I actually began making films, and the voiceovers are in the book, about responding and naming some of the people that I had lost to AIDS, naming them to kind of honor them,
Mm-hmm.
and what's interesting is today, when I talk at colleges and different places, young people don't understand what AIDS was like in the 80s and 90s. Currently, it's a chronic, manageable disease, and there's much less stigma around it. But it was terrifying for people, and people were thrown away from their families, and the society. It was just a nightmare. And so, to me, making sure to tell that history, I did something at Vermont Pride Center, and afterwards, someone came up to me and said, "I'm so grateful to know this because I have no idea what the struggles were."
Well, your artistic work, your films, in those you're able to be very raw. You show a vulnerable side. And then there's this other administrator role that you have where your work is pretty analytical, it's nearly political, it's very polite often. So how do you balance these two sides of yourself?
Well, I used to not do that. And one time, the Harvard Film Archives was showing some of my films, and I was still working at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And after the screening, someone raised their hand and said, "Do you ever get confused with that guy with the same name that works at the Walker?" And I thought, oh, how silly that I bifurcated my life, and that it's really important to me now to lead an undivided life. And I think this book kind of brings it all together, the hybrid nature of my life, my career. And, sometimes you think as an artist, if you have other jobs, you're seen as less of an artist, or if you're an administrator, you seem less as an administrator if you're also an artist. But I sort of gave all that up.
And you are indeed both.
Thank you.
So your writings also dive into you being a person with a disability, following a rather botched operation that left you paralyzed. And you have fought to regain and sustain your mobility in a remarkable way over the last 25 years. But how has disability affected your worldview?
Well, 25 years ago, I woke up from surgery where I was told that I would be in the hospital 3 or 4 days with a sore neck for a month. I woke up paralyzed, completely quadriplegic. And as you know, it took 3 months for me to learn to walk again. The good thing is I had been a dancer as a young kid, and I don't have much sensation in my legs even now. But I learned to stand up visually using the mirror. And the rehab people were like, "Wait a minute." I said, no, I was a dancer. I think this might work. And so that part I was lucky with. But right from the beginning, Fran, I really wanted to tap into my artistic side as well. I wanted to start writing about the experience. I wanted to reach out to other artists with disabilities because it was an invisible world to me as well. But suddenly it became really almost impossible to navigate the world. And in the book, I have I think a lovely interview with Judy Smith, who's the founder of the Axis Dance Company that's been to Vermont many times. And she is someone who uses a wheelchair. And we talk about how arts organizations, accommodations, physical accommodations is not access. 1990, the ADA was like, put the ramps in, but that's not really. So in this part of the book, we talk about how cultural organizations had to change the way they were presenting work to make it more accessible to all, but it benefits everybody.
Well, you certainly opened my eyes and heart to lives lived with a disability and the enormous creative possibility and output of artists who are physically different that you brought to the Flynn. So I thank you for that. And but I'd like to move on. As a young man, you actually spent time in the Himalayas at a monastery. And tell us about the role that Buddhism has played in your life.
I so love that you read so much of this book. Thank you. In the 70s in New York, I was in my 20s, and I started encountering some of the Buddhist teachers. And I was very intrigued by this. The Irish Catholic boy in me was like a whole new world was looking up. And I did, in the end of the 70s, go to a Buddhist monastery for a month. And it really changed my life. You know, I saw miracles. I saw a belief that things could happen. And there's a great phrase called beginner's mind. And, you know, it's in a beginner's mind, there's many possibilities. In an expert's mind, there's few. And it's sort of how I functioned my whole life. I never was trained to be an administrator, but from a dancer, I went to managing Church of Brown's dance company and had to learn how to do that. I then was at the Pew Foundation and was managing a $23 million budget. I had no idea, you know. And even today, you years ago came out and met my Shetland pony.
Raindrop.
And yeah, Raindrop, my Shetland pony Raindrop. And what's interesting about that is that I drive her in a cart because I don't have much use of my legs, but I can sit in the cart. But what's amazing about having a horse is you have to show up every day, and every day begins anew. You know, what we did yesterday doesn't count for what we have to do today. And it is my happy place to go to that barn because I have no gravitas there. I have no authority there. I'm just Raindrop's dad there.
Well, very focused. Well, speaking of things, so you are now on your second term as a legislator. So quickly, what surprised you about being a legislator, yet another role for you?
What I loved about it is how similar it is to be an artist. Okay, so when you're a dancer, you are rehearsing, you make things the best they can be, then you try to make them better. Or if it's not working, you drop it. Sometimes you're a soloist, sometimes you're an ensemble member. Same thing as when I make films, right? You have your storyboard, you shoot it, you have your lighting people, you have your sound people, you have the people in the film.
And you work with them. John, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have just 30 seconds left, and you know, the performing arts have been hit very hard, and you talk in an essay that you are, it's an opportunity for change. So quickly, what is your hope for the arts post-pandemic?
That we learn from this moment in the pandemic and racial reckoning, and we don't rush to put everything back together the way it was. This is a transformative liminal moment that can really help all of us.
John Killacky, thank you so much for your time today. Take care. And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.